Thank you very much. Just to confirm, do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Perfect. Well, thank you very much again for allowing us to share some of the results emerging from this Colombia job diagnostics. Again, stressing that this is a team effort spearheaded by Yana Carranza, William Wiseman, Ana Lucia Cárdenas, and also Josie Fassbender, who is a recent graduate from the Harvard Kennedy School. They've all contributed to this analysis. Just brief in terms of background, Cesar already gave a very comprehensive background in terms of where this particular exercise sits. It was a request from the government to provide some analytical underpinnings to the labor reform consultation process that was launched in response to a deterioration in pre-COVID-19 employment indicators. And it's a report that we prepared in response to this request. The report builds on the World Bank's job diagnostics methodology, which itself borrows heavily from the growth diagnostics approach developed by Hausman, Roderick, and Velasco, and therefore, what better place to be sharing these results than with you guys who basically work at the birthplace of this approach. I should stress that the approach, the methodology, is very Bayesian in its way it's conceptualized. So for those that expected some fancy identification strategy or more sophisticated modeling approaches, I'm afraid I think I'm going to be disappointing you today. It's what we try to do in this analysis is to really reflect, the economy as a whole, to analyze descriptively the different patterns and relate them to each other in order to, to define some policy priorities and inform the policy dialogue with the government. Very briefly on the World Bank's, on the job diagnostics inquiry chain. So we usually start by documenting symptoms. We rely on the whole breadth of data that is available, micro level data, household level surveys, firm level surveys, but then combine it also with macro data that's available and other ancillary data sets that we have from the World Development Indicators of the bank, but also some other data sets that allow us to do some benchmarking. Then the second step involves organizing these various symptoms into some sort of challenges, or you could call them syndromes. So it's basically a sort of clustering approach where we try to bring some sense to all these patterns that we observe. And then the third step then involves trying to identify some causes as to what is driving these overarching challenges. And then finally, and I'm not going to be really talking about this today, is defining policy interventions that give or propose a solution to these issues. The time frame that we analyzed is the 2009 to 2019 period. That was because the government wanted us to focus on that period, and again, we relied on a very rich set of data sources that Colombia has. Colombia has excellent data, as Cesar already mentioned, which really facilitated this analysis. So we count us very lucky in that regard. So let me very briefly, describe those symptoms that we observed. This is more to, establish the overall arcing picture. We're going to run through them quite quickly because I would like to get to the identification of causes, because I think that's probably the most interesting area. So therefore, bear with me if I skip through them, to these issues or these symptoms a bit quickly. we can come back to them if you have further questions at the end of the presentation. So we document basically 3 blocks of different symptoms. First, macroeconomic context and key structural features and key trends. In terms of the macroeconomic characteristics that we identify is that Colombia experienced positive growth over the last decade, but with a slowdown during the second half of the decade, which coincided with the decline in oil prices. So the fluctuations in the economy that we observe are strongly linked to the commodity super cycle. Colombia is an oil exporter, and that's important to keep in mind when we interpret what's happening in the economy. We also saw that, as so often the case in commodity-driven economies, growth was heavily driven by internal demand with limited contribution of exports. In this figure here, what you observe is, Colombia is being benchmarked against regional peers, so the major economies in the Latin American region: Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, I think, are in this group. And what we observe is in Colombia, growth was heavily driven by internal consumption, and that exports contributed very little to the overall growth performance. Now, what we also see is that the labor market was very sensitive to this economic cycle. Note that, even during the years of the deceleration, starting in 2014 roughly, Colombia was still growing at 2 to 3% per annum. And nevertheless, and Cesar alluded to this, we saw a strong deterioration in labor market outcomes with increasing unemployment, declining labor productivity growth, and stalling labor force participation. So what we see is that the labor market is reflecting these cycles very strongly, and that was basically the first overarching result that emerged from this analysis. Then, in terms of the key structural features, what we saw is that the share of services in employment is very high, but labor productivity, on the other hand, is rather low. And how we establish this is usually by conducting some benchmarking with countries that are at a similar level of development as Colombia. And what we see there is that indeed, services really accounts for a lot of employment, and the productivity in the services and also in agriculture is low. And this suggests that these sectors are partly absorbing maybe a surplus in labor, and where people are being employed in low value added activities, which are then both contributing to a lot of people in those sectors, but also then to the worse labor productivity outcomes. We also observe that urbanization is very high in Colombia. So Colombia is an outlier when compared to its peers. But whilst in other countries that have high levels of urbanization, productivity, so value added per worker, is high in agriculture. In Colombia, it is still relatively low. Also, we observe that wage employment is very low in Colombia, and earnings are very low. So if you again focus on this figure on the left hand side, and you look at these two box plots on that figure, what you observe is that Colombia really is an outlier in terms of wage employment it is generating, compared to other peers at similar levels of development. And that probably has to do with the fact that a lot of people are being forced into informal activities because of the lack of quality jobs or waged employment jobs in the formal sector, and therefore are forced to accept employment in low value added activities that are largely informal. and also in the services sector, as I mentioned early on, right? And that is reflective then of the fact that earnings per hour, so this is not wages per hour, this is earnings, average earnings per hour in Colombia are relatively low if we compare it to other countries in the region. Another interesting fact that came out of this descriptive analysis was that wage jobs are particularly limited for the less educated and rural workers. So whereas 43% of the working age population that has completed secondary education has a wage job, only 22% of the working age population with less than secondary have a wage job. And if we just focus on those that have a formal wage job, so one that has that has a contract and pays social security, the shares are really, really very low. So only 7% of those with less than secondary education have a wage job in the formal sector. And then also, the availability of wage job is particularly low in rural areas, which again then links to the fact that the urbanization rates are so high. Then in terms of key trends, I think it's important to highlight that the workforce has become increasingly educated over the last decade. There were only 42% or only 42% of the working age population was or had above had completed secondary education, whilst this share increased to 56% by 2019. Now, what's interesting is that over that decade, most of the new jobs that were generated really benefited those that were more educated. So those that had more than secondary education, whilst the number of jobs for low-skilled, which we define in the report to illustrate this point, as those with less than secondary education declined. And this is interesting, particularly if we compare it to the evolution of wages, where what we see is the opposite pattern. So actually wages, and this is wages, not earnings, rose more strongly for the less educated. So they remained rather flat for those that had either completed secondary education or had gone into tertiary, whilst they rose much more strongly for those that had only primary education, as you see on this figure here on the right. Then,
Andreas, if you don't mind, can you give us some more context in what might be driving this and how we should?
Yes, I'm going to come to that. So this is, you just
great.
to kind of take it as a descriptive analysis, and I'll come to some of the identification of causes in a second. So I'll come to this precise fact in a second, if you give me 5 more minutes. And so just then briefly again, employment or job creation was driven by services, construction sector, and with limited contribution of the manufacturing sector, which again is interesting. So we have this notion of a premature deindustrialization effect that Colombia is going through. And at the same time, to complete this overarching picture and facts that I'm throwing at you, we see that prices in the services and construction sector rose, whilst prices in the manufacturing sector declined. So we have type of Dutch disease effect that are affecting the economy. We also see that non-extractive exports fell relative to imports. So, with this in mind, we then organized all these symptoms, so all these different issues that I've mentioned, and tried to, somehow make some sense out of all of this. And we define, 5 challenges. And the first one was, we said that, there's clearly a slowdown in net job creation combined with a high exposure to the labor market, to the economic cycle, where you have these, labor market, reflecting the boom-bust cycle that one observes in many oil-driven economies. Then secondly, there's insufficient employment diversification and high dependence on the services sector. That has in part to do with the fact that the economy is suffering from some of the Dutch disease effects, where manufacturing is really suffering, and I will show you more evidence on that in a second, and where most of the employment creation is coming from services. The third challenge is that there's a high concentration of urban areas with very limited availability of jobs in rural areas, and that has to do with the fact that many of the rural areas are very far away or badly connected to the urban centers, limiting really the employment potential of those areas. Finally, no, of course not finally yet, limited wage jobs for the less skilled in the population, implying that the earning levels are very low, high rates of self-employment and high levels of informality. And fifth, that for those that have more skills, they are very exposed to this economic cycle where they are facing lower returns to schooling, rising unemployment rates because they have ambitions to get a job in the formal sector, and therefore unemployment spells actually increased for the more educated. Now, I know I've gone through this very quickly and apologize for that, but it's probably not possible to go into all these issues at length. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to identify, or I'm going to talk about some causes of this, and maybe that will explain why we observe some of these patterns, and I think also give some basis for further reflection and possibly some starting or some entry points for research, for academic research, I think. So in terms of the candidates that we discussed as potential drivers or causes for these patterns, we consider a whole range. We analyzed the data, we discussed it with the government, but there was really one that seemed to be a very important constraint. So if you could say, probably one of the most binding constraints was the minimum wage. And I'm going to focus on that a little bit, and it will explain some of the issues that we saw early on, for example, why wages diverged by education level. So the first issue is that the minimum wage rose quite strongly over the decade, and had differential impacts on depending whether you had higher or lower levels of education. And we see this in these two figures. So we really see that as the wage or the minimum wage increases, it pushes up earnings or wages for particularly the lower skilled that are closer to that minimum wage threshold, right? And it affects much less the workers that have more education. So here defined as those with secondary education or above. So you see it's affecting much less the distribution. It is affecting it as well, but the density around the minimum wage is much lower than for the unskilled. And that we then confirm also in terms of the overall increases of wages, or the average wages that unskilled perceive versus those that have more skills. That's what we show you here. So these are hourly wages of the unskilled. They rose by 25% more over the decade than the hourly wages of the more skilled, right? Which increased roughly with the CPI. So there's really this fork in the evolution of wages, which we believe is related to the minimum wage, and that potentially has negative consequences on firm activity, particularly in the formal sector, and the ability for the formal sector to be a driver of employment growth, particularly for those more affected by minimum wage hikes, right? And what we see is, that it is particularly the firms in the manufacturing sector that are more intensive in unskilled labor, and it's also the smaller firms that are more intensive. So what we wanted to do is to see, okay, how much is this potentially contributing to the to the struggle the manufacturing sector is facing, and to the decline in the contribution to overall employment of the manufacturing sector. So is it driving some sort of this premature deindustrialization? And so for
Anders,
yes.
Quick question, just in the previous slide.
Yeah.
Are the weights adjusted for CPI? Is it after adjusting for inflation?
So
or
these are nominal? These are nominal.
Okay, thank you.
These are nominal wages. Yeah. Right. So then what we looked at is at the first the manufacturing sector, and what we wanted to know is how is it affecting the distribution of the firm size distribution. And what we observe is indeed that the number of small manufacturing first increased with a boom, but then decreased very drastically in number as the decade proceeded, and not the same like among larger firms. The same pattern was not observable. So we really see that the firm size distribution implied that a lot of the smaller firm exited or became informal, because this is formal level data. So that's something we don't know. We were not able to establish, but certainly they were not part of the formal sector anymore. And this is census type data. So it really captures the entire firm population, if you want. And this was very strongly associated with a drop in operating margins for smaller firms. So what you observe here on this figure on the right-hand side is that operating margins, diverged. There's a clear fork with smaller firms, displaying a decline in median operating margins, and the larger firms, experiencing a small increase. And then we tried to establish, okay, is this divergence in operating margin somehow associated with changes in the relative cost structure of smaller versus larger firms? And we did indeed find this. So we found that there's the reduction in the operating margins matches a strong increase in wage costs amongst the smaller firms, while larger firms were much less affected by increasing wage costs. Other non-labor costs, so including intermediate consumption and other costs that firms face were evolved much more similarly across the different firm sizes. And then we said, okay, this is clearly something there happened with the manufacturing sector. It seemed to be very exposed to these increases in the wage costs, particularly the ones driven by the minimum wage and the impact that had on low skilled. And what happened to the services sector? Did we see the same thing, or is the services sector somehow showing a different pattern? And what we see is indeed that these things did not play out the same way in the services sector. So if we look again at the evolution of median operating margins for firms of different sizes, but now in the service sector, as you see here on the left-hand side, we didn't really see any, this fork that we observed for the manufacturing sector. Neither did we observe, median wage costs rising differentially among, as a share of total output. I should stress, rise differentially for different firm size groups. And then, we wonder, like, what could be driving this? And I think this is quite interesting what we came up with. So what we see is that, in the services sector, the evolution of wage costs is strongly correlated with output prices. So there's a high pass-through effect from cost to prices in the services sector. And you see this here, I'm just giving you a couple of subsectors within the services sector. There's, it's a strong, positive correlation there that we observe over time. And we did not observe the same in the manufacturing sector. This is the manufacturing sector. So this is food processing, logistics. No, this is not logistics and storage services. I'm sorry, this is a mistake. I would need to check which one this is. This is also a manufacturing sector. But the point here being that there is much less of a correlation between prices, output prices, and wage costs in the manufacturing sector than what we observe in the services sector. And I think overall, this really points to a picture where the minimum wage increase observed in Colombia really had strong compositional effects, not only within sectors, not only within the manufacturing sector, but also had strong effects on that premature deindustrialization that you observe, that probably combined with Dutch disease effects that the economy experienced, then contributed to employment moving out of the manufacturing sector, hindering job creation of less skilled in the population, particularly formal job creation, forcing people that had less skills then to take up jobs in more informal type of activities, self-employment, and therefore really kind of creating this divide between the two Colombias, if you so want. So to conclude, I think it's an interesting case study, Colombia, because it has done reasonably well over the last 2 to 3 decades, but the constraints are clearly increasingly becoming coming to the fore and increasingly binding. Labor regulations, we think, is a key area for Colombia to focus on, and it's a key impediment to further growth. And we believe that the structural patterns of Colombia are heavily intertwined with the type of regulatory environment in the labor market that was adopted over the last 2 decades. And it really suggests that the high and rising minimum wage is contributing to premature deindustrialization. So I wanted to open up the discussion maybe with 2 reflections, and this is maybe to also establish a link to more academic research. I think there's an increasing literature about the inevitability of services becoming a driver of economy structural change, as opposed to the manufacturing sector. So there's the idea that manufacturing can in the future not play maybe this role that it played in the past, particularly if you look at the Chinese miracle. And I think maybe these insights here on Colombia provide some nuance to that. And I think maybe we should also reflect about policies that are potentially exacerbating that drive or that push into services and this premature deindustrialization effects that are not necessarily inevitable. And we might want to think about this more carefully. And I think there's also a research agenda potentially emerging from this, which is something that some studies have, I think some papers have highlighted, which is that minimum wages, particularly in economies that are not industrialized, not fully industrialized yet, or not fully developed yet, not advanced economies yet, that where the minimum wage can have strong compositional effects and affect structural change in itself. And I think I haven't seen much on this in the literature, and I think it'd be a fascinating topic to delve into with some more, let's call it, academic research that maybe these results that we come up with in the Job Colombia job diagnostic could be a relevant entry point for. I leave it there. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.